Chapter 1: The Echoes of a Ruin. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Close your eyes. It is 1965. You are standing on a rain-slicked construction site on the outskirts of Brussels. The air smells of wet concrete and ozone. Before you, a skeletal frame of steel cables sags under its own ambition. This was supposed to be the second coming of a miracle. This was supposed to be the rebirth of the Phillips Pavilion. But instead of the triumphant music of the future, there is only the sound of engineers arguing over slide rules and the haunting whistle of the wind through failed geometry. Why are we here? Because in 1965, a group of brilliant minds tried to do the impossible. They tried to resurrect a ghost. The original Phillips Pavilion, built for the 1958 World Expo, was more than a building, it was a sensory revolution. It was the world's first true multimedia experience. And then, it was demolished. The 1965 rebuild attempt is one of history's most expensive architectural heartbreaks. It wasn't just a failure of money, it was a failure of mathematics, a clash between the temporary magic of art and the rigid demands of permanent engineering. How does a masterpiece resist its own recreation? How did the laws of physics turn against the men who try to honor them? Today, we peel back the layers of the stomach of light and discover why some wonders are only meant to exist once. Chapter 2: The Trinity of 1958, Le Corbusier, Xenakis, and Varèse. To understand the 1965 failure, we must first look at the holy trinity of creators who defied logic in 1958. The Philips company didn't want a tent, they wanted a showcase for their electronics. They approached Le Corbusier, the high priest of modernism. But Corbusier was at a point in his life where he was bored with standard windows and doors. He told Philips, "I will not give you a facade. I will give you a poème électronique." But the secret hero, the man whose ghost would haunt the 1965 engineers, was Iannis Xenakis. Xenakis was a refugee, a resistance fighter, a mathematician, and a composer. He looked at the blueprints and didn't see walls, he saw glissandos. He took the sliding pitches of his musical compositions and translated them into the language of the hyperbolic paraboloid. Then entered Edgard Varèse, the stratospheric composer. He created a soundscape that would travel through the walls. This wasn't a building housing an exhibit, the building was the exhibit. The structure was a thin shell of concrete, a mere few inches thick, held in a state of violent tension. It was a stomach that digested the audience and spat them out changed. In 1958, this was a miracle. In 1965, it would become a curse. Chapter 3: The Geometry of the Impossible, Technical Deep Dive. Let's talk about the math that broke the hearts of the 1965 team. The pavilion was designed using ruled surfaces. Imagine taking two sticks and connecting them with dozens of straight strings. If you twist the sticks, the strings form a beautiful, sweeping curve. This is a hyperbolic paraboloid. In 1958, they built this using precast concrete slabs hung on a network of steel cables. It was essentially a concrete tent. The thickness was incredibly minimal, only about 5 centimeters. This thinness was only possible because the building was temporary. It only had to stand for 6 months. When the 1965 team sat down in Brussels to rebuild it, they faced a nightmare. Modern building codes for a permanent structure demanded fireproofing, insulation, and, most importantly, structural redundancy. You couldn't just hang 5 centimeters of concrete on cables and call it a public museum in 1965. To make it permanent, they calculated that the shells needed to be at least twice as thick. But here is where the physics betrayed them. In a thin shell, the stresses are mostly membrane stresses, the building breathes the load. But when you thicken the shell to meet 1965 safety standards, you introduce bending moments. The elegant, thin curves started to crack under their own increased weight. The music of the geometry was being drowned out by the noise of gravity. Chapter 4: The Brussels Ambition, the Socio-Political Climate of 1965. Why 1965? Why Brussels? By the mid-60s, Belgium was riding a wave of technological optimism. The 1958 Expo had put them on the map, and they wanted a permanent cultural anchor. The Phillips Pavilion was the one that got away. The 1965 project was funded by a consortium of tech enthusiasts and local government officials. They saw it as a palace of light. They believed that with 1960s technology, better steel, more advanced concrete pouring techniques, and early computer modeling, they could fix the flaws of the 1958 original. They approached it with the arrogance of the new decade. They thought the 1958 version was primitive because it was built with slide rules and hand-drawn sketches. They didn't realize that the primitive nature of the 1958 build was exactly why it worked. It was flexible. It was daring. The 1965 team tried to turn a poem into a textbook. They began clearing the site in Brussels, but as the first structural tests came back, the reality set in. The site's soil composition was different from the 1958 location. The foundations required to hold a permanent version were massive, ugly, deep concrete piles that killed the floating aesthetic of the original. The dream was already beginning to sink into the Belgian mud. Chapter 5: The Ghost in the Machine, the Failure of the Audio-Spatial Experience. In 1958, the interior of the pavilion was a cavern of sensory overload. It featured the Poème électronique, a composition that didn't just play, it moved. Using a system of 350 loudspeakers divided into sound routes, the music of Edgard Varèse literally crawled up the walls and descended from the peaks of the hyperboloids. When the 1965 team attempted to replicate this, they hit a wall of technological incompatibility. By 1965, the audio world was moving toward high-fidelity stereo, yet the 1958 system was a complex, bespoke multi-track tape system that relied on the specific acoustic reflections of the thin, raw concrete shells. The 1965 engineers discovered that their permanent shells, now thickened and coated with modern fire-retardant materials, had different resonant frequencies. The stomach no longer sounded like a cathedral, it sounded like a basement. The engineers tried to use early transistor technology to manage the sound routing, but they couldn't replicate the warmth and chaos of the original vacuum tube amplification. The 1965 audio tests resulted in terrifying standing waves and acoustic dead zones. The ghost they were trying to summon was being strangled by the very technology meant to enhance it. They realized that to make the sound work, they would have to redesign the interior geometry, which meant the building would no longer be a replica. It was a paradox: to save the sound, they had to destroy the shape. Chapter 6: Lost Blueprints and Dark Data, the Archive Mystery. One of the most tragic hurdles of the 1965 attempt was the discovery that the original 1958 construction was, in many ways, an improvised miracle. While Le Corbusier provided the vision, the actual execution on the ground in 1958 involved hundreds of on-the-fly adjustments by Xenakis and the contractors. When the 1965 Brussels team went to the archives, they found a void. Many of the technical drawings for the specific tensioning of the steel cables had been lost or were never formally recorded. The 1958 pavilion was built in a fever dream of deadline pressure for the World Expo. It was architectural jazz. The 1965 engineers, led by more rigid bureaucratic standards, tried to reverse engineer the structure from photographs and a few surviving sketches. They spent months trying to digitize the curves, but the math didn't add up. Every time they tried to plot the coordinates of the three soaring peaks, the curves would overlap in ways that were structurally impossible for a permanent building. They weren't just fighting gravity, they were fighting the lost secrets of a dead construction crew. The dark data of the 1958 build remained buried in the rubble of the original site. Chapter 7: The Death of Le Corbusier, the Loss of the North Star. August 27, 1965. A date that signaled the final death knell for the project. Le Corbusier, the face of the project and the only man with the political capital to force the Belgian government to keep funding the disaster, went for his daily swim in the Mediterranean at Roquebrune Cap Martin. He never returned. He suffered a heart attack in the water. With Corbusier's death, the 1965 rebuild lost its North Star. The developers in Brussels were suddenly left with a project that was failing technically and had lost its legendary guardian. Without Corbusier to shout down the critics, the Belgian press began to turn. They called the project Corbusier's Folly and a ghost ship of concrete. Iannis Xenakis, the true mathematical mind behind the shape, was by now deeply embroiled in his own musical career and political exile. He had little interest in helping a corporate rebuild that was compromising his original mathematical purity. The 1965 teen was now truly alone, working on a monument for a man who was no longer there to bless it, based on math they couldn't fully solve. Chapter 8, Financial Freefall, The Withdrawal of the Titans. By the end of 1965, the financial reality of the permanent pavilion became a nightmare. The original budget, which had already been twice the cost of the 1958 build, was now projected to quadruple. The complexity of the pre-stressed concrete panels was the main culprit. In 1958, Phillips had absorbed the costs as a marketing expense. But in 1965, the corporate landscape had shifted. Phillips was looking toward the burgeoning television and computer markets. They saw the 1965 rebuild as a nostalgia project that offered little return on investment. When the structural engineers reported that the foundation work alone required to stabilize the asymmetric peaks on the soft Brussels soil would take another year and another several million Belgian francs, Phillips pulled the plug. They withdrew their branding and their funding. The project was left as a half-excavated scar in the ground. The dream of a permanent electronic poem died not with a bang, but with a series of frantic phone calls from accountants. The permanent pavilion had lasted less time in the planning phase than the temporary one had lasted on the expo grounds. Chapter 9, The Xenakis Conflict, Purity versus Compromise. The 1965 engineers finally reached out to the source, Iannis Xenakis. But the meeting was not a rescue, it was an execution. By 1965, Xenakis had transitioned from an architect in Corbusier's shadow to a titan of avant-garde music. He looked at the 1965 redesigns, the thickened walls, the added support columns, the attempts to make the building symmetrical for the sake of stability, and he was revolted. For Xenakis, the Phillips Pavilion wasn't a building you could simply patch up. It was a mathematical glissando. In his musical compositions, like Metastases, the curves were calculated to a decimal point of precision. To Xenakis, adding a support column to the pavilion was like adding a wrong note to a symphony just because the violinist's arm was tired. He refused to endorse the 1965 rebuild. He argued that if the laws of physics in 1965 required a thicker, uglier structure, then the structure should not exist at all. This created a moral crisis for the project. How do you build a tribute to a genius when the genius himself calls your version a mutilation? The tension between artistic purity and engineering safety became an unbridgeable canyon. Chapter 10, The Final Collapse, The Day the Music Died. In late 1965, the Brussels site was a graveyard of ambition. The project was officially mothballed. But the collapse wasn't just physical, it was bureaucratic. The remaining blueprints, the early computer punch cards they had used to try and simulate the loads, and the scale models were packed into crates. There is a haunting story, perhaps apocryphal, but widely whispered in architectural circles, that on the day the project was officially cancelled, one of the lead engineers burned the 1965 revisions in a trash can on site. He reportedly said, "If we cannot build it right, we must not leave a record of how we built it wrong." The site was filled back in with earth. The stomach of light was buried. The failure was so complete that for decades, architectural history books barely mentioned the 1965 attempt. It was a collective trauma for the Belgian modernist movement, a reminder that their reach had finally exceeded their grasp. The silence that followed was louder than any of Varèse's speakers. Chapter 11, Comparative Failures, Why the Future Cannot Be Rebuilt. Why is it that we can reconstruct a Greek temple from 2,000 years ago, but we couldn't rebuild a concrete pavilion from 7 years prior? Chapter 11 explores the philosophy of modern materials. Stone is patient. Concrete is temperamental. The Phillips Pavilion was a performance piece. It was built for a specific atmosphere of 1958 optimism. The 1965 failure highlights a unique problem in modern architecture: technical obsolescence. In 1958, the pre-stressed concrete technique was a daring experiment. By 1965, it had become a standard industry practice, but with that standardization came a loss of the experimental spirit. The 1965 engineers were too smart for their own good. They knew too much about why the building shouldn't work, whereas the 1958 crew was just crazy enough to try it. We see this today with digital art and software. Sometimes the original environment is the only place a masterpiece can truly live. To move it to a new operating system, like 1965 Brussels, is to break the code. Chapter 12, The Legacy of Silence, The Final Echo. We end where we began, in the reign of Brussels. The Phillips Pavilion exists now only in black and white photographs and low bitrate audio recordings of the Poème électronique. The 1965 failure served as a crucial lesson for the high-tech architects who followed, like Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. It taught them that if you want to build the impossible, you cannot look backward. You cannot rebuild the future. The 1965 attempt was the last time anyone tried to physically recreate the pavilion. Today, students at universities use VR headsets to walk through a digital ghost of the structure. In the virtual world, the walls can be as thin as a single pixel. In the virtual world, there is no gravity, and the sound never fades. Perhaps that is the only place the Phillips Pavilion was ever meant to live, in the space between math and dreams. Thank you for joining us on this long, strange journey through the wreckage of 1965. The electronic poem is silent now, but if you listen closely to the wind in Brussels, you might still hear the ghost of a glissando. This is Synapse Daily. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories.